My dad's 60th birthday party was the kind of event my mother had been planning for 8 months. She'd rented out the back room of Caruso's, the Italian place on Millbrook Avenue that my parents considered fancy because it had cloth napkins and a maitre d' who knew their names. She'd ordered a custom cake from the bakery 2 towns over. She'd made a slideshow. 60 years, she kept saying on the phone with my aunt. 60 years of a life well lived deserves 60 people in a room celebrating it. I found out I wasn't one of those people through my brother. He texted me on a Tuesday night, which is how I knew it wasn't going to be a good conversation. My brother only texts on weeknights when he needs something or when he's been appointed to deliver news someone else doesn't want to deliver. He's always been the messenger. He likes it, I think. It gives him a reason to be in the middle of things. Mom wanted me to let you know about Dad's party, he wrote. It's the 14th at Caruso's. She said she didn't think you'd feel comfortable coming. You know, with everything. I stared at that text for a long time. With everything. I stared at that text for a long time. With everything. That was the phrase my family had started using sometime around my 24th birthday to describe the fact that I had left a stable job as a dental office administrator to build a UX design studio out of my second bedroom. With everything meant your choices. With everything meant the way you threw away a sure thing. With everything meant we don't know how to explain you to our friends and relatives, so it's easier if you're just not there. I was 27 when my brother sent that text. I had been running my studio for 3 years. I had 4 clients, small businesses mostly, a nonprofit, a local law firm, and I was barely covering rent on my apartment in Eastfield, which I shared with my friend Ren, who was a nurse and who kept odd hours and who never once made me feel like a failure for eating cereal for dinner 4 nights in a row. We had a good life in that apartment. Ren would come home at 7 in the morning and I'd already be at my desk, and she'd drop a coffee next to my keyboard without saying a word. And that was the kind of support I didn't know I was missing until I had it. My family's version of support was different. My mother called it concern. My father called it realism. My brother called it nothing because he just nodded along to whatever my parents said and then texted me later to soften the edges. It had started the year I quit the dental office. I'd come home for Thanksgiving and my father had asked me, genuinely curious, when I was planning on getting a real job. Not unkindly. He wasn't a cruel man. He just had a very specific map of what a life was supposed to look like, and I had folded mine in the wrong places. My mother was harder. She'd sit across from me at the kitchen table with her coffee and her worry, and she'd ask questions that weren't questions. Don't you think it's risky doing this on your own? Wouldn't it be smarter to have something steady while you build the business? Your cousin just got promoted. Did I tell you that? Regional manager now, she told me every time. Every single time. The thing about my family is that they weren't bad people. They paid their bills. They went to church on holidays. They loved each other in the practical, undemonstrative way of people who grew up without much, and learned that love looks like showing up and paying the mortgage and not making things harder for the people around you. By their definition, I was making things harder. I had left a job with benefits. I was building something invisible, something they couldn't describe to their friends at the country club fundraisers my mother chaired twice a year. My brother had married his college girlfriend and taken a job in pharmaceutical sales, and bought a house in the same suburb where we grew up, 3 miles from my parents' house. He had 2 kids by 30. He was, in my mother's eyes, living proof that the right choices existed and could be made. I was the other proof, the cautionary tale they hadn't quite given up on yet. So when the text came about the party, I understood it immediately, even though it took me a while to put it down and breathe through it. My mother hadn't invited me to my father's 60th birthday because she didn't want to explain me. She didn't want to sit across from my aunt and my father's work colleagues and their kids with their steady jobs and their mortgages and have to answer questions about what I was doing. It was easier to say I couldn't make it. It was easier to make me a story she could control. I didn't call her. I thought about it. I had a whole conversation in my head where I said everything I actually felt, and in that conversation, she cried and apologized and said she hadn't realized how it would come across. But I knew that conversation wasn't real. The real conversation would be her explaining her reasoning in a calm voice and me ending up apologizing for making her feel guilty. And I didn't have the energy for that. I texted my brother back. Okay, thanks for letting me know. And then I sat in my desk chair in the dark for a while. And then I opened my laptop. And then I went back to work. The thing nobody tells you about building something from nothing is how boring most of it is. Not in a bad way. In the way that anything real is mostly just showing up repeatedly in unremarkable rooms. I had a whiteboard in my second bedroom covered in sticky notes. I had a client management spreadsheet I updated every Sunday. I had a folder on my desktop called Reference that I'd been adding to for 3 years. Screenshots of interfaces I loved, layouts that worked, the particular way a well-designed app could make a person feel understood. My background was in graphic design, technically. I'd taken 2 years of community college courses and then taught myself the rest through online tutorials and library books and a lot of trial and error. When I'd worked at the dental office, I'd redesigned their patient intake forms in my lunch breaks because the original ones were genuinely terrible, hard to read, confusing, the kind of form that made anxious people more anxious. And the dentist, Dr. Harlan, had noticed. He'd asked who redid the forms. He'd said it was the best thing that had happened to the practice in 5 years. He'd given me a small bonus and I'd gone home and cried. Not because of the money, but because someone had seen something I made and called it good. That was the moment I understood what I was supposed to be doing. The dental office wasn't the wrong job because it was bad. It was the wrong job because it asked nothing of the part of me that mattered. I could have done it for 40 years and been fine and been miserable and never known the difference, which is the worst version of a life I can imagine. I started taking small freelance projects on evenings and weekends. A new logo for a friend's catering business. A website for a yoga studio in town. I was slow at first and charged almost nothing because I was learning and I knew it. Ren let me practice pitches on her. She'd sit on the couch after her night shifts, wrapped in a blanket, and give me completely honest feedback in the way that only very tired people can. That slide is confusing. This part sounds like you're apologizing. Lead with thing that's actually impressive. By the time I quit the dental office, I had 3 paying clients and enough savings to cover 4 months of rent. It wasn't comfortable. It was never comfortable. But there's a particular kind of clarity that comes from having no backup plan, and I used it. My first real breakthrough came from a local restaurant group that needed their entire digital ordering system redesigned. They'd built their app in-house and it was a disaster. Drop-offs at checkout, confusing menu navigation, a loyalty program that almost nobody used because it took 8 steps to access. I spent 6 weeks redesigning it. I tested it with actual customers. I sat outside the restaurant on a Saturday morning and asked people to use the old version and then the new version while I watched. I took notes on where they hesitated, where they got frustrated, where they smiled because something worked the way they expected it to. The restaurant group's owner, a woman named June who had the energy of someone who slept 4 hours a night and considered it a full rest, looked at my final presentation and said, "How soon can you start the build?" We launched the redesigned app 8 months later. Within the first quarter, checkout completion went up 32%. The loyalty program signups tripled. June referred me to 2 other businesses she knew. That's how it works when it works. It's not one big moment. It's one person telling another person, and then you're in a different room than you used to be. I didn't tell my family any of this. I'd tried in the early days. I'd called my mother when I signed my first real contract and she'd said, "That's nice, honey, but what happens when they don't renew?" I'd mentioned the restaurant redesign to my brother, and he'd said, "Cool. So like app stuff?" In a way that made it clear he wasn't going to ask a follow-up question. My father had stopped asking about the business around year 2, which was both a relief and a specific kind of grief I still don't have a clean word for. So I stopped reporting in. I kept my head down and I worked. And I let the distance grow in the way that felt survivable. The party happened on the 14th. My father turned 60 in a back room at Caruso, surrounded by 60 people who weren't me. My brother sent me a photo the next morning, my parents laughing, my dad with his arm around my mom, the cake half eaten behind them. "Great night," he wrote. "You were missed." I don't know if he believed that. I don't know if anyone actually asked where I was. I looked at the photo for a long time. My dad looked happy. He looked like a man who had made the life he intended to make. And that was fine. That was good, even. I just wasn't in it. I put my phone down and I went back to my whiteboard. The project that changed everything came in through a referral from June's accountant, which is such a boring and real way for something life-altering to arrive that I still laugh about it. His name was Phil, and he had a client, a healthcare startup called ClearPath, that had built a telehealth platform for rural patients and was absolutely hemorrhaging users at the onboarding stage. Nobody could figure out why people were downloading the app and then abandoning it within the first 10 minutes. I figured it out in 45 minutes of user testing. The onboarding flow asked for too much information too soon. It was designed by engineers who wanted all the data up front, and it felt like filling out a tax return before you'd even decided you wanted to use the service. Patients who were already anxious about healthcare, which is nearly all of them, especially in underserved communities, hit the third screen of forms and simply left. Not because they didn't want the service, because the service didn't feel like it was for them. I redesigned the entire onboarding experience from the ground up. I moved the essential information to the back end after the user had already experienced the platform. I added a single question on the first screen. What brought you here today? Just that. Just a way for the app to acknowledge that there was a person on the other side of the screen who had a reason for showing up. Completion rates during beta testing went up 61%. ClearPath would live with the new onboarding in March. By May, they had been covered in 3 healthcare trade publications and 1 long feature in a national newspaper about how good design could address healthcare access gaps in rural America. The journalist who wrote the feature called me for a quote. I was standing in my kitchen in pajamas eating yogurt when she called, and I tried to sound like a person who received press calls regularly. My studio was named in the article, 2 sentences toward the end, but it was there. I sent Ren a screenshot and she texted back a series of increasingly unhinged celebration emojis, and then immediately fell asleep because she'd just come off a 12-hour shift. I printed the article out and taped it to my whiteboard. I allowed myself 1 glass of wine, and then I went back to work. The referrals after the ClearPath article were a different category than what I'd had before. These were companies with actual budgets. Companies where the first call was with a VP of product, not the founder. Companies that had RFP processes and legal teams and vendor onboarding checklists. It was a lot. I hired 2 contractors, a visual designer named Beck who worked out of Portland, and a researcher named Solange who I'd met at a UX conference in Austin and who was, genuinely, the best listener I had ever encountered in a professional context. I incorporated the studio properly, got business insurance, opened a real business bank account instead of just using my personal one with a mental note to separate expenses later, started paying myself an actual salary, which still felt vaguely illegal even though it obviously wasn't. By October of that year, we had 6 active clients. By December, I was turning work down. I remember the specific evening when I realized things had actually shifted. I was working late, the city was quiet, Ren was at the hospital, and I'd pulled up my invoicing software and just sat there looking at the numbers for a while. Not because they were spectacular, they weren't, not yet, but because they were real. I had made something real. Something that employed 2 other people and served clients who told me, regularly, that what we built together had changed something meaningful in their businesses or their mission or the lives of the people they served. I thought about calling my mom. I didn't. My brother called me on a Wednesday in February, which was even more unusual than a Tuesday text, and I knew immediately that something was happening. Hey, he said. So, Mom saw something on mine. He explained it in the circling way he explains things he's uncomfortable with. There had been a second article, it turned out, a profile in a design industry publication, longer than the first, with a photo of me at my desk. The whiteboard in the background covered in sticky notes. The piece was about women building design studios without traditional backing. The journalist had framed it as a story about trusting the invisible work, which is a phrase I'd used in the interview and which I genuinely believed. My mother had found it. She had called my brother. She had apparently cried, which was the information my brother was most uncertain how to deliver. She's really proud, he said. She wants you to know that. I was quiet for a moment. I was sitting at my desk, and I was looking at the whiteboard, and I was thinking about a Tuesday night text that said she didn't think you'd feel comfortable coming. Okay, I said. She wants to have dinner, he said. The whole family. She said she's been thinking about things, and she feels terrible about the party and she wants to make it right. I asked him when this dinner was supposed to happen. He named a Saturday 3 weeks out. I had a client deliverable due that Friday. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it very much, actually. I already knew the answer. I just needed a few days to feel certain about it. What I knew was this. My mother had not called me when I signed my first contract. She had not called me after the ClearPath article. She had not sent a text when I hired Beck and Solange, or when I incorporated, or when I had any of the 100 small victories that I had stopped reporting because there was no one in my family who wanted to receive them. She had found a profile in a design publication and cried and called my brother, and now there was a dinner invitation. I knew what the dinner would be. I knew my mother would hug me too long at the door and say she'd always believed in me. I knew my father would ask questions about the business with the careful interest of someone who has recently been informed they should be asking questions. I knew my brother would be pleasant and say, "Really impressive, sis," and refill everyone's wine. I knew my aunt would be there and my father's work colleagues, or some of them, the ones who could now be told a clean story about the daughter who'd built a design studio that was written up in the newspaper. I knew how it would feel to sit at that table. I knew I would spend the whole evening being a story they were finally comfortable telling, a success they could package and present, a proof of something that had nothing to do with who I was or what I built and everything to do with what I could now do for them, for their narrative, for the way they explained our family to other people. I called my brother back on a Thursday. "I'm not going to make it to dinner," I said. He was quiet. "I have a project deadline," I said, "and I really can't move it. Please tell Mom and Dad I love them and I hope everyone has a good time." He started to say something about rescheduling. I told him we could talk about that another time. I told him I had to go. I told him to hug the kids for me. I hung up and I sat for a while. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that because the story of moments like this is supposed to involve some clean rush of vindication, and that's not what it felt like. It felt quiet. A little sad, the way the right choices sometimes are. I thought about my dad at 60 in a restaurant without cloth napkins and the laughing photo and the half-eaten cake. And I felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief and didn't have a name I knew. Then I thought about Dr. Harlan Sang, who redesigned these forms, and Ren dropping coffee on my desk in the early morning, and June saying, "How soon can you start?" and the patient in the ClearPath beta test who completed the whole onboarding on the first try and looked up from his phone with this small, surprised expression like he'd expected it to be harder. I thought about Beck in Portland and Solange, and the whiteboard, and the invoicing software and the numbers that were real. I opened my laptop. I went back to work. There's a conversation I've had with myself many times over the last few years, and it goes something like this. Maybe they didn't know how to show up for the version of me that was unfinished. Maybe loving someone doesn't automatically mean you know how to believe in them, especially when what they're doing doesn't look like anything you've seen succeed before. Maybe my mother's fear was real even when it was damaging. Maybe my father's skepticism came from somewhere that had nothing to do with me. Maybe I can hold all of that and still decide that there are some doors I don't owe anyone. I haven't had the dinner. Not that one anyway. My mother has called several times. We talk. It's fine, mostly. She tells me about my brother's kids and the fundraiser she's chairing and what my aunt said. She asks about work in the careful way of someone navigating a subject they don't fully understand and have been informed they should engage with more thoughtfully. I tell her things are going well. That's true. I expanded the studio last spring. We're 6 people now, not counting contractors. We have an office, a real one, not a second bedroom, and a building downtown with a lobby and a card access door and a coffee machine that costs more than my first car. I have a client in 3 time zones, and I've spoken at 2 conferences, and I am still, on most mornings, the first person at my desk. Ren came to the office warming party. She brought her girlfriend and a bottle of very good Prosecco and stood in the middle of the room with her arms crossed and this expression on her face like she was personally responsible for all of it, which she kind of was, actually. My brother came too. He stood in the corner for a while looking at the whiteboard, which I'd brought from the apartment because I couldn't imagine my office without it. He said, "You did all this." Not a question, just a thing he was letting himself understand. "Yeah," I said. "Mom's going to lose her mind when she sees this place," he said. "She's welcome to visit," I said. And I meant it, actually. That's the thing I want to be clear about. I'm not building walls. I'm not constructing a revenge story where my family is the villain and I'm the hero who finally proved everyone wrong. That's not what happened, and it's not how it feels from the inside. What happened is that I built something real, and in doing that, I learned what it feels like to be fully believed in, which was not, it turned out, something I could wait around for my family to provide. What happened is that I learned to live inside my own story without waiting for their chapter titles. What happened is that I stopped needing the seat at the table so desperately that I could say no to it when it was offered at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. That's not revenge. That's just growing up, I think. It just took a whiteboard and a second bedroom and a nurse who drops off coffee at 7 in the morning and a restaurant owner named June who said, "How soon can you start?" and about 4 years of choosing every single day to stay at my desk. I still have that printed article taped to the whiteboard. The photo is a little crooked and the tape is yellowing at the edges. I keep meaning to frame it properly. I probably won't. Some things are better kept exactly where you can see them from your chair. I used to think the hardest part was proving myself. I was wrong. The hardest part was learning that I didn't need to. There's a version of this story where I go to that dinner, where I sit at the table my mother set and I smile at the relatives who didn't know what I'd been building, and I let the evening become a kind of quiet forgiveness, the kind that's more about keeping the peace than actually meaning anything. I know that version. I almost lived it, but something in me had learned by then that walking back into a room that had closed its door to you just because the door was suddenly open again wasn't courage. It was just a different kind of need. What I had to understand, slowly and not all at once, was that the way people treat you when you have nothing tells you everything about what they actually value. My family didn't mean to be cruel. I want to be clear about that still. They were scared people operating from a very narrow definition of what a life could look like, and I didn't fit it. And so they made decisions that protected their comfort at the cost of mine. That's not a villainous thing, it's a very human thing. But it still happened, and it still had consequences. And those consequences were real whether anyone intended them or not. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Actions don't need bad intentions to cause real damage. My mother didn't invite me to my dad's party because she didn't want to explain me. That's the truth of it. And no amount of crying over a newspaper profile could undo what that exclusion had already taught me about my place in the family story. What it taught me, though, ended up being useful. Because when the people who are supposed to believe in you don't, you have two options. You can spend your energy trying to convert them, trying to become legible enough for their approval, trying to fit yourself back into the shape they need you to be. Or you can take that same energy and use it to build something they couldn't have imagined, something you couldn't have imagined, something that only existed because you stopped waiting for permission to start. I chose the second one. Not heroically, just practically, because I ran out of the patience required for the first. June saw something in a restaurant app redesign that most people would have called a minor business improvement. She called it worth telling other people about. And she did. Rin saw a person trying to build something real at a kitchen table, and she dropped off coffee without making it a whole thing, and that mattered more than she knows. Beck saw a studio worth joining when it was still just me and a whiteboard in the second bedroom. These people chose to believe in something unfinished, and that choice was not accidental. It came from the same quality that every person with good judgment has, the ability to see potential that isn't yet performing. That's what I think about now when I sit at my desk. Not the party I didn't go to, not the dinner I declined. I think about what it means to be seen clearly without conditions attached, and how rare that is, and how worth protecting. The door to my office has a card reader and a glass panel, and my studio's name on the wall beside it. Anyone who walks through it now is there because they want to be there, and because I invited them, and because the relationship was built on something real. That's the only table I'm interested in sitting at. I think that's what 4 years behind a whiteboard actually taught me. Not how to design better, how to choose better, who deserves a seat in your life, and when it's okay to keep certain chairs empty.